In part one, we talked about triplanar projections. In part two, we talked about bitmaps and a little bit about Substance Painter. Now on to part three, where we'll talk about noises. And the game plan here is to talk about noises, we'll go through some of the technical parameters, and then we'll take our focus on more of the artistic application of noises. It's important to know the basics for the technical stuff, but once we have that, then I think it's important to shift our focus onto the aesthetic portion. Once we get done with that, we'll then go through a few miscellaneous topics just to round out your knowledge in general. And then at the very end, we'll talk about all the techniques we've learned so far and, when should you use a triplanar projection? When should you use noises? We'll talk about the circumstances which make sense for these various techniques, as well as some ideas in combining these techniques, just depending on whatever situation it is. Now, I'm sure most of you have used a noise at some point or another. You go into a VOP context, you throw down an anti-alias noise or a turbulent noise, and most people might adjust a setting or two, but for the most part, that's it. And the big issue with that is that person's work is going to look like everyone else's work, because that's where most people stop when it comes to noises. And so this problem is something that you see all the time in effects. It's also something that you see within texturing, and when it comes to texturing, it's going to be extra noticeable if that's what you do. So we need to figure out something else besides that. Instead, here's my recommendation to you. Either option one is that you go beyond the basic setting changes that everyone else does. So you can try to be really intricate or fancy with how you apply noises and VOPs. You can layer it in a interesting way. You do things to try to cover your tracks so that people can't figure out that you just used a noise. That's fine to do. Even better is if you have knowledge of how to make these algorithms. Maybe you can even code some things to make your own noises. That would be interesting. So that's option A. Option B, which is what we'll be doing, is you can rely on the noises that were made by a different render engine. So in this case, I'll be using Redshift. Redshift has all these great noises that were made ahead of time. It comes with the render engine itself. And instead of maybe like 4 or 5 noise options that you have in VOPs, this now has 35 options. Well, 34, 35, it's something like that. You have way more options, and because of that, you can achieve a wide variety of different looks with not having to invent everything from scratch. And it's just a better way of working, especially when it comes to the texturing components of using noises. So that's true for Redshift, RenderMan, V-Ray. Pretty much if you go out and buy any other major rendering package, they're probably going to come with some noises that are improved from what Houdini offers you by default. So if you're somebody who doesn't have, let's say, another render engine that you're using, that's okay. You can still follow along with this course, but just know that a big part of being able to make your stuff look great and a big part of the shading technique comes from having the right ingredients to use when you're trying to layer on these noises, work quickly, and get great looking results. Again, if you're not using the right tool, you just can't really do the technique as I'm about to show it. So keep that in mind, and that'll serve you well in the future. Okay, so now that we've talked about what a noise is and just some of the practical advice I have for you guys when it comes to noise, let's talk about the manifolds. And I'm sure many of you have no idea what that is. So the manifold, or the transform space, or the coordinate space, or what else do they call it? Or the texture space, they're all talking about the same thing. And this is probably the most confusing thing about noises, okay? Noises need to find a way to stick to your object, right? Again, it's just a math equation. It creates values that exist, let's say in three-dimensional space. So you might have a value here, here, right? Something needs to happen so that these values can stick to the surface of your object. And so whenever you hear these terms, like again, the manifold, the texture space, sometimes depending on the application, you might just have a locator, right? This is all talking about how it can attach itself to the object. And so that's the first thing that we'll talk about. Think of it like this. Let me get this water bottle here, sponsored by Iceland Springs. They didn't pay me, but you know, whatever, it's cool. Let's say that you want a noise that's along the surface here, right? Well, again, the noise has to stick to this water bottle. So what we can do is we can use a locator, which is just the same thing as a null. It's not something that you see in the scene. It's just something that moves around. It has a transform value, an XYZ coordinate, right? And we can attach that null to this water bottle. So that as the water bottle moves around, so too would the null, so too would the transform, right? Well, what's cool about this is that we can take our noise values and we can have it move with the null that's attached to the object. So the object moves, so too does the null, moves with the object, the noise gets attached to the null, and so because of that, the object, as it moves, will also move the values that were generated by the noise. And that's what we would call object space. So whenever you see object space, that's exactly what's happening. The noise values are attaching itself to a null that's attaching itself to whatever object it is. As the object moves, so too does the noise. Now our noise can stick to the surface of the object. So whenever you see that, that's what that's referring to. We also have something called world space. And world space is different because the noise attaches to, let's say, a null. That null is at the origin of your scene, so it's at coordinates 0, 0, 0. And as the object moves, the noise is not going to move with the object. And so because of that, you know, imagine values in three-dimensional space. Let's say that this is a section of white. Here's another white section, another white section. As the object moves in space, the noise isn't moving with this guy, so we get something that's called swimming, where the values are kind of swimming through this object, or I guess the object is swimming through the values that aren't moving with it. And then the next space that is most commonly used is called the rest space, or if you use a rest transform, that is another way of attaching a noise to an object, and it's actually the best way of attaching a noise to an object. I'll talk about that here in a minute because I also want to say that you could also use your UVs, and you know that's something you could do. UVs are, again, UVW. They're just coordinates. They represent where something is at in space. And so perhaps one reason why you might do that is to bake out textures, bake out 2D textures using noise values. However, it's not something that you would do very often. And the reason why you wouldn't do that very often is because if you're using a noise, chances are you're using a noise because you don't even want to deal with UVs. UVs, you're trying to get around them using a noise. That's one reason why you would use a noise. So, you know, UVs, it's possible, but it's just not used very much. So the main things that you would use when it comes to the manifold, the coordinate space, all that, is object space, or you would use rest coordinates. Or if you want to have that swimming effect that we talked about, then you would choose world space. And so anyway, we'll go over that again. I know that was talking a little bit fast through that, but it'll make sense once I show you here in a second what that is. And this is universal to any application. So if you go to Substance Designer, you go to Maya, Mari, it doesn't matter. The manifold, the texture space, is something you have to know about noises in order to make sense of how this works. So we'll start with that, and in the next lesson, let's go over a few examples of those manifolds that I was telling you about, and then once we do that, we'll talk about some of the other technical parameters that surround a noise.